I still get the mortgage statements for the house where my husband lives with his new wife. Every month, I see my name as the primary borrower on a home I'll never enter again. People always ask how I didn't see it coming, how someone as smart as me, as successful, as careful with details, could miss the signs that my husband was building an exit strategy while I was building us a future. The truth is, I was too busy laying the foundation to notice he was already planning to walk away from the house. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. I met Daniel in graduate school back when we were both broke students living on ramen and ambition. He was studying literature, I was getting my MBA. He had this dreamy artistic quality that drew me in immediately, the way he'd quote poetry during casual conversations, how he'd get lost in books for hours, the gentle way he moved through the world like he was perpetually thinking about something more beautiful than whatever was right in front of him. I was the opposite, practical, driven, always thinking 3 steps ahead. I had spreadsheets for everything, my course schedule, my part-time work hours, my 5-year career plan, even our date nights once we started seeing each other seriously. Where Daniel floated, I anchored. Where he dreamed, I planned. It felt like perfect balance then. Our first apartment together was a cramped studio above a Chinese restaurant. The smell of lo mein permanently infused our clothes, and the radiator clanged like someone was trying to break out of prison every night. But I remember lying in that narrow bed, Daniel's arm around me, talking about the future we'd build together. He described the house we'd have someday, big windows, built-in bookshelves, a garden where he could grow herbs. I'd talk about the practical stuff, how we'd save for a down payment, what neighborhoods had the best appreciation rates, how we could leverage my starting salary to qualify for a good mortgage. Even then, I was the one doing the math while he painted the picture. I graduated first and landed a job at a consulting firm that paid well but demanded everything. 60-hour weeks were standard, 70 during busy seasons. Daniel was still finishing his thesis, so I supported us both on my salary. It felt natural, temporary. He was brilliant, just not in ways that immediately translated to income. I told myself we were investing in his potential and our shared future. He'd have dinner waiting when I got home at 9 or 10 at night, usually something simple but thoughtful, pasta with fresh herbs from the windowsill garden he'd started, bread he'd baked during his afternoon writing breaks. He'd ask about my day, massage my shoulders while I vented about difficult clients or impossible deadlines. He made our tiny apartment feel like a sanctuary from the corporate world that was slowly consuming me. I started making spreadsheets for us as a couple, joint budgets, savings goals, debt repayment plans for my student loans. Daniel would nod along when I showed him the numbers, but I could see his eyes glaze over. He trusted me to handle the practical stuff so he could focus on the important things, his writing, his art, the life of the mind that made him who he was. I told myself this division of labor made sense. I was good with money, he wasn't. I enjoyed planning and organizing, he found it stressful. We were playing to our strengths, creating a partnership where my practical skills supported his creative ones. It felt mature, evolved, like we'd figured out something other couples struggled with. After Daniel graduated, he got a job teaching at a private high school. The pay was terrible, but he loved it. He'd come home with stories about his students, excited about a particularly insightful essay or a breakthrough moment in class discussion. I loved seeing him fulfilled, even if his entire monthly salary barely covered our groceries. I had gotten promoted twice by then, and my income was good enough to carry both of us comfortably. We moved to a better apartment, still small, but with actual separate rooms and a kitchen that didn't smell like other people's dinner. I furnished it mostly from my savings, chose everything from the couch to the coffee maker. Daniel appreciated it all but seemed content to let me make those decisions. He was focused on his teaching, his writing, the evening graduate courses he'd started taking toward a master's degree. The first time I brought up buying a house, Daniel seemed genuinely surprised. We were walking through a neighborhood I'd researched, good schools, reasonable prices, decent commute to both our jobs. I'd already run the numbers, figured out what we could afford, even identified a few properties I wanted to see. He stopped walking and looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, part admiration, part bewilderment. He told me I'd really thought about this, as if the idea of planning our financial future was somehow remarkable. I explained that we couldn't rent forever, that we were just throwing money away. He kissed my forehead in that gentle way he had that always made me feel both loved and slightly patronized. He wondered aloud what he would do without me, said I thought of everything. I took it as a compliment then. Now I realize it might have been something else entirely. The house hunting process was entirely mine. I researched neighborhoods, scheduled showings, analyzed market trends, compared mortgage rates. Daniel came along to the appointments, offering opinions when asked, but mostly he seemed content to let me drive the process. He'd comment on architectural details or natural light while I calculated property taxes and resale potential. We found the house on a Saturday in October, a three-bedroom colonial with the big windows Daniel had always wanted and enough space for the home office I needed. The moment I walked through the front door, I could see our entire future laid out, Daniel's books lining the built-in shelves, dinner parties in the dining room, maybe children playing in the backyard someday. The asking price was at the top of our budget, but I'd crunched the numbers obsessively. With my income and credit score, we could make it work. Daniel seemed dazed by the whole process, the paperwork, the financial requirements, the sheer complexity of buying a home. I handled all of it, from the pre-approval to the final walkthrough. I'll never forget signing the mortgage documents, page after page of legal language and financial obligations, most of it in my name because my income and credit qualified us for the loan. Daniel signed where required, but I was the primary borrower, the one ultimately responsible for the monthly payments that would stretch across the next 30 years of our lives. He marveled that this was really happening as we handed over the cashier's check for the down payment, money I'd saved over 3 years of careful budgeting and strategic investments. I replied that we were homeowners, that we'd done it, squeezing his hand. But even then, some part of me noticed that he spoke as if he was watching something unfold, while I spoke as someone actively creating it. Moving in was a blur of boxes and decisions. I hired the movers, organized the utilities, researched furniture and appliances. Daniel helped where he could, but he seemed overwhelmed by all the details involved in setting up a household. I found myself taking charge of everything from the internet installation to the neighborhood association paperwork. I loved it, honestly. There was something deeply satisfying about creating a home from scratch, about making thousands of small decisions that would shape our daily lives. I chose the paint colors after researching which ones would photograph well when we eventually sold. I selected appliances based on energy efficiency ratings and warranty terms. I planned the furniture layout to maximize both function and flow. Daniel contributed in his own way, hanging artwork, arranging his books, planting the herb garden he'd always wanted. But the foundation, the structure, the practical reality of our shared life, that was all me. Our first dinner party in the new house was a success. Friends from work, a few of Daniel's teaching colleagues, some couples from my graduate program. I planned the menu, bought all the food, coordinated the timing. Daniel helped with the cooking and charmed everyone with his stories and observations. I remember standing in our kitchen, watching our guests laugh at something Daniel was saying, feeling this deep sense of accomplishment. I had built this, not just the evening, but the entire context that made it possible. The house, the stability, the life that allowed us to be generous with others. One of my friends cornered me while I was loading the dishwasher later. She told me how lucky we were, called Daniel such a catch, said we had everything so figured out. I smiled and nodded, but something about her comment stuck with me. She was praising Daniel for being charming while congratulating me for having things figured out, as if my competence was a given while his appeal was a gift. The first few months in the house were blissful, or at least they felt that way in memory. I'd wake up in our king-sized bed, which I'd researched extensively before purchasing, and feel this sense of deep satisfaction. We owned this. We had built something lasting together. I threw myself into home improvement projects with the same intensity I brought to everything else. I researched contractors, got multiple quotes, managed renovations. We updated the master bathroom, refinished the hardwood floors, installed a security system. Every improvement was an investment, I told myself. Every dollar spent was making our shared asset more valuable. Daniel seemed happy, or at least content. He loved his spacious home office, the quiet neighborhood, the short commute to his school. He started hosting a book club in our living room, colleagues and friends gathering monthly to discuss literature over wine and cheese I provided. I enjoyed these evenings, even when the conversation drifted into theoretical territory I couldn't follow. I was proud of the space we'd created, the hospitality we could offer. But there were small moments that should have warned me. The way Daniel would sometimes seem surprised by household expenses, as if he'd forgotten we had a mortgage and utilities and property taxes. How he'd make casual comments about money as if it were an abstract concept rather than something that required constant attention and planning. He'd suggest we take vacations, browsing travel websites during his summer break. When I'd ask where he wanted to go, already mentally calculating what we could afford after the new roof and the quarterly property tax payment, he'd mention places like Tuscany with a dreamy expression. He'd talk about renting a villa, spending a month writing and reading and drinking wine. I'd show him the numbers, what Tuscany would actually cost, how it would affect our savings goals, what we could afford instead. He'd nod and agree to the more modest option, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. as if I were being unnecessarily practical, crushing his dreams with my spreadsheets and realistic expectations. I started to feel like I was managing two things, our actual life and Daniel's fantasy version of our life. In his mind, we were a couple who could afford spontaneous trips to Europe and expensive dinners out and whatever caught his fancy. In reality, we were a couple where one person's income supported the other person's lifestyle while building equity in shared assets that required constant financial attention. The divide became more apparent as Daniel settled into his teaching routine. His schedule was different from mine, long breaks between semesters, shorter workdays, summers mostly free. While I was putting in my usual 60-hour weeks, he was home by 4 most days, with time to read and write and pursue his interests. I envied him sometimes, but I also felt proud of providing that freedom. My income gave him the security to choose a job he loved rather than one that paid well. My careful financial planning meant he didn't have to worry about the mortgage or the car payments or the retirement contributions. He could focus on the meaningful work while I handled the practical necessities. But somewhere in that first year in the house, I started noticing changes. Small things at first. Daniel staying up later, often still reading or writing when I went to bed exhausted from work. Weekends when he seemed distracted, physically present but mentally elsewhere. Conversations that felt more surface level, less connected than they used to be. I told myself it was normal adjustment stuff. We were both adapting to home ownership, to the new rhythms of our life together. I was working longer hours to pay for all the improvements and expenses. He was exploring new creative projects now that he had space and stability. Growing pains, I thought, the natural evolution of a long-term relationship. But then came the night that changed everything. I was working late, as usual, when I realized I'd left my phone charger at home. I drove back to get it, expecting to find Daniel grading papers or reading in his office. Instead, I found him on our couch, the couch I'd researched and saved for and carefully selected, talking on the phone in a voice I'd never heard before. Soft, intimate, almost musical. He was laughing at something the other person said, and the sound made my stomach drop. I stood in our entryway, listening to my husband flirt with someone else in the home I'd built for us, and finally understood what I'd been missing. While I was constructing our future, he was already planning his escape from it. The receipt I found 3 days later was just confirmation of what I'd already learned in that moment. Daniel wasn't just unhappy with our life together, he was actively building a different one, with someone else, using the stability and security I provided as a foundation for his betrayal. As I stood there holding that receipt, $37 at a restaurant I'd never been to, on a night he claimed to be working late, I realized that everything I'd built, every careful decision and sacrifice and investment, had been constructed on completely false ground. I was the architect of my own destruction, and I hadn't even known I was holding the blueprints. That receipt became my obsession. $37 at Romano's Bistro, a place I'd never heard of despite living in the same city for 6 years. The timestamp showed 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when Daniel had texted me that he was staying late to finish grading midterms. The charge was for 2 entrees, 1 appetizer, and a bottle of wine that cost more than we usually spent on groceries for a week. I became a detective in my own marriage, and I was terrifyingly good at it. I started checking our credit card statements with the same methodical attention I brought to quarterly earnings reports at work. Every charge, every date, every location cross-referenced against Daniel's claimed whereabouts. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. Tuesday dinners when he was supposedly working late. Saturday afternoon charges at coffee shops across town when he claimed to be home writing. Movie tickets purchased in pairs when I was traveling for business. The most devastating discovery came 3 weeks after Romano's. A charge for $73 at a bookstore I recognized, the independent place downtown where Daniel and I used to browse on Sunday afternoons during our early dating years. We hadn't been there together in over 2 years, but apparently Daniel had been going without me. The timestamp showed a Saturday morning when he told me he was meeting his department colleagues for coffee. I drove to the bookstore that same afternoon, my hands shaking as I parked across the street. Through the large front windows, I could see Daniel at a small table near the poetry section, leaning forward in animated conversation with a woman I didn't recognize. She was younger than me, maybe late 20s, with the kind of effortless style that suggested she read French novels and owned vintage vinyl records. Her laugh was loud enough that I could hear it through the glass, and Daniel's face lit up in response with an expression I couldn't remember seeing in months. They looked like lovers, not in any overtly physical way. They weren't holding hands or kissing, but in their body language, the way they mirrored each other's movements, the invisible bubble of intimacy that surrounded their table. They looked the way Daniel and I had looked in that same bookstore 5 years earlier, when everything felt possible and love seemed like the most natural thing in the world. I sat in my car for an hour, watching them through the window like some pathetic private investigator. When they finally left together, walking slowly down the sidewalk with the reluctant pace of people who didn't want their time together to end, I followed them for 3 blocks before forcing myself to turn around and drive home. Daniel arrived 2 hours later, full of stories about his boring department meeting and complaints about how tedious his colleagues could be. He kissed my forehead and asked what I'd done with my day, and I lied as smoothly as he did. I was learning his language, becoming fluent in deception. The evidence accumulated like sediment. Phone records showing lengthy calls to a number I didn't recognize, always during times when I was at work or traveling. Email notifications on his laptop, just glimpses before he quickly closed the screen, but enough to see female names that weren't mine. Changes in his appearance, new clothes I hadn't seen him buy, a different cologne, attention to grooming details he'd never cared about before. But it was the emotional evidence that cut deepest. The way Daniel had become a stranger wearing my husband's face. Conversations that skimmed the surface of everything important, as if we were acquaintances making polite small talk rather than partners who'd built a life together. The sex that had become infrequent and mechanical, his body present but his mind clearly elsewhere. The distance in his eyes when he looked at me, as if he were seeing me through a telescope from very far away. I started paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked. How Daniel no longer mentioned future plans that included me, no talk of vacation destinations or weekend projects or holiday visits to see family. How he'd become vague about his schedule, mentioning meetings and obligations without specifics. How he'd stopped asking about my work stress or offering the shoulder rubs that had once been our nightly ritual. The worst part was realizing how long it had been going on. As I traced backward through credit card statements and phone records, the timeline of his deception stretched back almost 8 months. 8 months of lies, of living a double life while I supported him financially and emotionally, while I made mortgage payments and planned our future and worried about his happiness. I calculated the numbers obsessively, the way I did everything else. 8 months of dinners with her while I worked late to pay for our house. 8 months of afternoon coffee dates while I handled the refinancing paperwork that lowered our monthly payments. 8 months of emotional investment in someone else while I researched vacation packages and anniversary gifts and ways to bring more romance back into our marriage. The financial audit was almost as painful as the emotional one. During those 8 months, I had single-handedly covered the costs of our life while Daniel spent money on building a relationship with someone else. The fancy dinners, the concert tickets, the gifts I found evidence of but never received myself, all funded indirectly by my salary, my savings, my careful budgeting that left room for what I thought were his small personal expenses. I started carrying the Romano's receipt in my wallet like a talisman, physical proof that my instincts were correct, that I wasn't imagining the distance between us. Sometimes I'd take it out during meetings at work, staring at the faded ink while colleagues droned on about quarterly projections. $37 that represented the moment my marriage revealed its true cost. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. I had prepared for weeks, gathering evidence and rehearsing what I would say. I imagined dramatic scenes, tears, shouting, passionate denials followed by tearful confessions. Instead, it happened on a Wednesday evening while we were loading the dishwasher after a dinner we'd eaten in virtual silence. I placed the receipt on the counter between us and asked Daniel if he wanted to explain what it was for. He looked at it for a long moment and I watched something shift in his expression. Not surprise or guilt, but almost relief, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, maybe even hopping for it. He told me about Sarah. Her name was Sarah and she taught art at a private elementary school. They'd met at a teacher training workshop 6 months earlier, started as friends, slowly became something more. He insisted it wasn't just physical, they connected intellectually, creatively, in ways he felt we no longer did. She understood his artistic side, encouraged his writing, made him feel like the person he'd been before life became about mortgages and utilities and practical concerns. I listened to him explain how he'd fallen out of love with me gradually, so slowly he hadn't even realized it was happening until he fell in love with someone else. How our life together had become a routine that stifled him. How my competence and control over our practical affairs made him feel unnecessary and small. How he'd tried to fight his feelings for Sarah but couldn't deny that she made him feel alive in ways I no longer did. The cruelest part was how reasonable he sounded, how he framed his betrayal as a natural evolution, an unfortunate but understandable response to our incompatibility. He never used the word affair. Instead, he talked about developing feelings and emotional connection and finding himself through his relationship with Sarah. I asked him how long he'd been planning to leave me. The question seemed to surprise him, as if the idea of planning anything was somehow foreign. He insisted he hadn't been planning anything, that he'd been hopping to figure things out, to find a way to be honest with me without destroying everything we'd built together. But even as he said it, I could see the truth in his eyes. He had been planning, just not consciously. Every dinner with Sarah was a step away from our marriage. Every lie was preparation for a life without me. Every day he delayed telling me was another day to solidify his exit strategy while keeping the security I provided. I asked about Sarah's situation, whether she knew about me, whether she understood that she was dating a married man whose wife paid for his lifestyle. Daniel looked uncomfortable for the first time, admitting that Sarah knew he was married but believed we were separated, that I was the one preventing the divorce from moving forward. Another lie, another revision of reality to make his betrayal more palatable. The conversation lasted 3 hours, circling around the same basic facts while Daniel tried to explain away his deception, and I tried to understand how the man I'd loved and supported had become someone capable of such sustained dishonesty. By the end, we were both exhausted, sitting at opposite ends of our expensive couch in the living room I'd decorated, surrounded by the life I'd built that he no longer wanted to share. Daniel asked if I thought we could work through this, if there was a way to rebuild what we'd lost, but the way he asked made it clear he was hoping the answer was no. He wanted me to be the one to end things, to make the decision that would free him to pursue his relationship with Sarah without guilt. I looked around our living room at the built-in bookshelves I'd commissioned, the hardwood floors I'd refinished, the mortgage documents with my name as primary borrower sitting in the file cabinet I'd organized. Everything I'd worked for, planned for, invested in, suddenly revealed as temporary, a foundation built on sand, just waiting for the right wave to wash it away. I told Daniel I needed time to think, and he nodded with obvious relief. He gathered some clothes and toiletries, explaining that he'd stay with a colleague for a few days to give us both space. As he packed, moving through our bedroom with practiced efficiency, I realized this wasn't the first time he'd planned this departure. The speed with which he assembled his essentials suggested he'd mentally rehearsed this scene many times. After he left, I sat alone in the house that felt simultaneously too big and too small. Every room held reminders of what I'd thought we were building together: the kitchen table where we'd planned our budget, the home office where I'd worked late while he spent evenings with Sarah, the bed where we'd made love less and less frequently as his attention shifted elsewhere. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise penetrated our carefully chosen quiet neighborhood. No neighbors were close enough for their sounds to carry. Just me and the house I'd selected, financed, and furnished, now feeling like a monument to my own naive expectations. I opened a bottle of wine, an expensive one I'd been saving for a special occasion that would clearly never come, and began making lists. It's what I did when life became overwhelming: reduce chaos to manageable categories, create action items from emotional devastation. By morning, I had 3 pages of notes: legal considerations, financial implications, logistical challenges, the practical aftermath of emotional betrayal, broken down into tasks I could actually complete. Daniel called that afternoon to check on me, his voice careful and concerned. He asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, whether I'd thought about what came next. The tenderness in his voice made me want to scream. Where had this consideration been during the 8 months he was lying to me? But I kept my own voice steady, told him I was fine, that I was handling things the way I always did. I could hear relief in his silence, the gratitude of someone whose guilt was being managed by the same competence that had managed everything else in our relationship. That night, alone in our king-sized bed, I finally cried, not the dramatic sobbing I'd expected, but quiet tears for the death of something I'd thought was permanent. I grieved not just for my marriage, but for my own blindness, for the months I'd worked overtime to pay for a life my husband was already planning to leave, for every sacrifice I'd made to build something he was busy dismantling. Most of all, I cried for the woman I'd been just days earlier, someone who believed in shared futures and mutual investment, someone naive enough to think that loving someone completely meant they'd love you back the same way. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone harder and more calculating. Someone who understood that love without strategy was just another word for exploitation. Someone who was about to learn exactly how much power she actually held. The first week alone in the house nearly broke me. Not from loneliness. I'd been essentially living alone for months without realizing it, but from the crushing weight of understanding how completely I'd been played. Every surface in every room held evidence of my own financial martyrdom. The Italian marble countertops I'd saved for 18 months to afford, installed while Daniel spent afternoons with Sarah. The custom built-ins that had maxed out 3 credit cards, completed during the same month he'd started lying about his whereabouts. The security system I'd researched obsessively to protect our home, activated for the first time just weeks before he began planning his exit. I walked through the house like a crime scene investigator, cataloging not just what was there, but what it had cost me. The hardwood floors, 2 months of overtime and a postponed vacation. The kitchen renovation, my entire year-end bonus plus additional savings. The master bathroom with the heated floors Daniel had specifically requested. A second mortgage I'd qualified for entirely on my own income and credit score. Every improvement had been my idea, my research, my financial planning, my execution. Daniel had contributed opinions and enthusiasm, but never money, never the tedious work of getting quotes and managing contractors and making sure permits were filed correctly. He'd been the dreamer while I was the engineer of our shared life. The most devastating realization came when I started adding up the numbers, not just the mortgage payments and utilities and property taxes I'd been covering solo, but the smaller expenses that had accumulated over the 8 months of his affair. The grocery bills that had mysteriously increased despite Daniel eating out more frequently. The higher credit card balances I'd attributed to inflation and lifestyle creep. The restaurant charges and entertainment expenses I'd assumed were work-related or friend gatherings. I spread 18 months of bank statements across the dining room table I'd selected and financed myself, creating a timeline of financial deception that mapped perfectly onto Daniel's emotional betrayal. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks and managing our household finances with military precision, he'd been spending my money to court another woman. The calculations were staggering. Over 8 months, Daniel had spent nearly $4,000 on his relationship with Sarah. Dinners, coffee dates, concert tickets, bookstore purchases, weekend trips he'd disguised as professional development conferences. $4,000 of discretionary spending that had been possible only because I covered every necessary expense in our shared life. I'd essentially funded my husband's affair without knowing it. The financial audit became an obsession that consumed my evenings and weekends. I created spreadsheets comparing our expenses before and during Daniel's relationship with Sarah, color-coded charts showing how money that should have gone to our shared goals had been redirected to his secret life. I calculated the opportunity cost of every dollar he'd spent on her, what that money could have accomplished if invested in our retirement accounts or applied to our mortgage principal. But the numbers, devastating as they were, couldn't capture the emotional mathematics of betrayal. How do you quantify the value of trust? What's the market rate for 8 months of lies? How do you calculate the compound interest on deception that grows more expensive every day it remains undiscovered? I started sleeping in the guest bedroom, unable to bear the king-sized bed I'd researched and purchased for us to share. The sheets still smelled like Daniel's cologne, the new one he'd started wearing for Sarah, and every night I lay there I was reminded of how many times he'd come home from dates with her and climbed into bed next to me, carrying the scent of his betrayal. The guest room felt safer but also pathetic. I was hiding in my own house, a house I'd designed and financed and furnished, driven out of my own bedroom by reminders of my husband's infidelity. Even in my attempt to avoid pain, I was surrounded by evidence of my own financial sacrifice. The guest furniture I'd bought for visiting family members who rarely came. The blackout curtains I'd installed after researching the optimal sleep environment. The air purifier humming in the corner, purchased during my phase of optimizing our home's air quality. Everything I touched reminded me of my own naive investment in a future that had been a lie. Work became my refuge, the one place where my competence wasn't mocked by betrayal. I threw myself into projects with manic intensity, staying late not because I needed to, but because the alternative was going home to the mausoleum of my marriage. My colleagues noticed the change, but attributed it to ambition rather than avoidance. I let them think what they wanted. It was easier than explaining that I was using 60-hour work weeks to avoid confronting the wreckage of my personal life. But even at work, the financial realities haunted me. During budget meetings, I'd find myself calculating how Daniel's affair expenses compared to our quarterly projections. Walking past restaurants, I'd automatically check if they were places he'd taken Sarah while claiming to work late. I started carrying a small notebook, obsessively recording every detail of our financial entanglement that I'd need to unravel. Divorce research began almost immediately, though I told myself I was just gathering information. I spent lunch breaks consulting websites about asset division and spousal support, learning the legal language for the dissolution of everything I'd built. The irony was brutal in our state. The house would likely be considered marital property despite being financed entirely through my income and credit. Daniel could potentially claim half the value of assets he'd contributed nothing toward creating. The legal consultations were even more devastating than I'd anticipated. 3 different attorneys told me essentially the same thing. Despite my disproportionate financial contribution to our marriage, the law viewed our assets as equally owned. The house, the joint accounts, the retirement savings I'd funded through my 401k contributions, all would be divided as if we'd been equal partners in building our wealth. Daniel could walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets that represented years of my sacrifice, discipline, and careful planning. Meanwhile, his affair expenses, the money he'd essentially stolen from our joint financial goals to fund his relationship with Sarah, would be nearly impossible to recover. Courts don't typically award damages for adultery, and proving the specific misuse of marital funds would be expensive and time-consuming. The attorneys spoke about lifestyle maintenance and spousal support, legal concepts that made my stomach turn. Daniel, who'd contributed maybe 30% of our household income over the past 3 years, could potentially claim ongoing financial support based on the standard of living my income had provided. I could end up paying him alimony while he lived with Sarah, funding his transition to the new life he'd built while betraying our marriage. One particularly brutal consultation included a discussion of the mortgage. Since the house was in both our names but the loan was primarily my responsibility, I had several options: buy out Daniel's half interest, sell the house and split the proceeds, or continue sharing ownership with my ex-husband. None of these options felt remotely fair or desirable. I began to understand why some divorces became so acrimonious. It wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. It was about watching someone walk away with half of everything you'd sacrificed to create while contributing minimal effort themselves. The legal system's presumption of equal partnership felt like a second betrayal, institutional gaslighting that ignored the reality of who had actually built what. The social dimension of the betrayal was almost as painful as the financial one. Daniel and I shared friends, colleagues, an entire social ecosystem that would need to be navigated carefully. I dreaded the conversations I'd eventually need to have, the explanations that would make me sound either bitter or pathetic. How do you tell people that your husband left you for someone else without sounding like you're seeking pity? How do you explain the financial dimension without appearing to reduce your marriage to a balance sheet? Some friends reached out after Daniel's absence became noticeable, asking casual questions about why they hadn't seen him lately. I deflected with vague references to busy schedules and work stress, buying time while I figured out how to handle the public relations of my private devastation. But the questions would become more persistent, and eventually I'd need to craft a narrative that preserved my dignity while acknowledging the death of my marriage. The hardest part was the revelation of my own enabling. During those long nights alone in the guest bedroom, I was forced to confront how I'd systematically created the conditions that made Daniel's betrayal possible. My willingness to handle all financial responsibilities had freed him to spend money on his affair. My competence in managing our practical affairs had allowed him to focus on emotional and creative pursuits, including his relationship with Sarah. My assumption that he shared my commitment to our shared future had blinded me to his growing distance and deception. I hadn't just been betrayed, I'd been complicit in my own betrayal through my patterns of overfunctioning and underexpecting. The rage, when it finally came, was clean and sharp and surprisingly energizing, not the messy emotion I'd expected, but cold fury at the efficiency of Daniel's exploitation. He'd used my love against me, weaponized my competence to create space for his infidelity, leveraged my financial sacrifice to fund his exit strategy. But rage, I discovered, could be transformed into strategy, and I was very, very good at strategy. Sitting at my dining room table surrounded by bank statements and legal documents, I began to see the situation differently. Yes, Daniel had betrayed me. Yes, the legal system would likely force me to share assets I'd disproportionately created, but I still held most of the cards in this game, even if I'd been too hurt and shocked to recognize it initially. The house was mortgaged primarily in my name, but I was also the one with the income to support those payments. The joint accounts were funded almost entirely by my salary. The credit cards were tied to my credit score and employment history. Daniel had been living off my financial foundation for so long that he'd forgotten how to support himself independently. He thought he was leaving me for a better life with Sarah. What he didn't realize was that he was about to discover exactly how expensive that better life would be without my subsidies. And I was about to make sure that lesson came with interest compounded daily. The transformation from victim to strategist didn't happen overnight, but it was surprisingly complete once it began. Every sleepless night in the guest bedroom became a planning session. Every lunch break spent researching divorce law became an education in leverage. Every moment of rage became fuel for a campaign I was uniquely qualified to wage. Because while Daniel had been learning how to lie and cheat, I'd been learning how to build and control financial systems. While he'd been investing in his relationship with Sarah, I'd been investing in assets and accounts and credit ratings. While he'd been planning his escape, I'd been creating the very infrastructure he'd need to navigate once he realized what he'd actually walked away from. He wanted out of our marriage. I was about to show him exactly how expensive that freedom would be. The first phase was simple information gathering. I needed to understand every aspect of our financial entanglement before I could begin to systematically untangle it in ways that served my interests rather than his assumptions. This wasn't revenge, it was resource management. I wasn't trying to hurt Daniel, I was trying to stop subsidizing his betrayal. But as I worked late into the night, surrounded by the evidence of everything I'd built and everything he'd taken, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Daniel thought he was the one who'd been planning and strategizing. He had no idea that his wife, the practical, boring, financially obsessed wife he was so eager to escape, was about to teach him the true meaning of long-term thinking. The game was just beginning, and I held all the cards he'd forgotten were in play. The moment I stopped being Daniel's victim happened on a Tuesday morning in my office, during what should have been a routine budget review meeting. I was presenting quarterly projections when my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel asking if he could come by the house to pick up more clothes. Something about the casual entitlement in his message, the assumption that he could access our home on his schedule, that I would accommodate his needs while he lived with another woman, triggered a clarity so sharp it was almost painful. I excused myself from the meeting and walked to the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the fluorescent light. The woman looking back at me had dark circles under her eyes, stress lines that hadn't been there 6 months earlier, the hollow expression of someone who'd been systematically drained. But underneath the exhaustion, I saw something else emerging, a hardness that had been building since the night I found him on our couch, laughing with Sarah. I texted him back that he could come by Saturday afternoon, and I would have his things ready for him in the garage. No access to the house. No opportunity to cherry-pick what he wanted while leaving behind what he didn't. If he wanted out of our marriage, he could live with the practical consequences of that choice. The shift felt tectonic, like some fundamental part of my personality had crystallized into something unrecognizable. For years, I'd been the accommodating partner, the problem solver, the one who made things easier for everyone else. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that kindness without boundaries was just another word for self-destruction. I spent my lunch break calling lawyers again, but this time with different questions. Instead of asking about my rights as a victim, I asked about my leverage as a primary earner and mortgage holder. Instead of focusing on what I might lose, I concentrated on what Daniel would need from me to maintain his new lifestyle. The conversation was illuminating and energizing in ways the previous consultations hadn't been. The house was the key. Daniel's name was on the deed, but the mortgage was primarily my responsibility. He could claim half the equity in a divorce, but he couldn't afford to buy me out, and he couldn't qualify for a loan to refinance in his name alone. His teaching salary was barely $40,000 a year, less than I spent on the mortgage, property taxes, and utilities combined. If I wanted to keep the house, I could force a sale and buy it back at market rate, which would be expensive but manageable with my income. If I wanted to hurt him, I could simply stop making payments and let both our credit scores crater, though that would damage me too. But there was a third option that was both strategically sound and emotionally satisfying. I could make it clear that his access to the equity he'd never earned was contingent on his behavior during our separation. The business was even more complicated and offered even more leverage. Daniel and I had started a small consulting company 3 years earlier, officially to help him develop additional income streams, but in practice it was another vehicle for my financial support of his goals. I'd provided all the startup capital, handled all the administrative work, and brought in most of the clients through my professional network. Daniel's contribution was creative input and client relations, important but hardly irreplaceable. The business had grown to generate about $20,000 a year in profit, not life-changing money, but a meaningful supplement to our household income. More importantly, it required active management, client relationships, and business development skills that Daniel had never fully developed. Without my connections and administrative support, the business would likely collapse within 6 months. But the real revelation came when I started researching our joint accounts and credit arrangements. For years, I'd been the primary signatory on everything financial, partly because of my higher income and credit score, but also because Daniel found financial management tedious and stressful. He'd been happy to let me handle the details while enjoying the benefits of our shared wealth. Now that casual arrangement had become a strategic advantage. I could close joint accounts and force Daniel to establish his own credit history. I could remove him as an authorized user on credit cards he'd relied on for daily expenses. I could cancel shared services like cell phone plans and insurance policies that required immediate replacement at his expense. None of these actions would be legally problematic. They were all within my rights as the primary account holder, but they would force Daniel to confront the practical realities of independence he'd never had to consider. Suddenly, his new life with Sarah would require security deposits, credit applications, and financial documentation he couldn't provide alone. I started making lists the way I always did when overwhelmed, but these lists were different. Instead of cataloging problems, I was identifying pressure points. Instead of planning how to minimize damage, I was calculating how to maximize leverage. The transformation from victim to strategist was complete, and it felt like discovering a superpower I'd never known I possessed. The first phase of my strategy was information and documentation. I needed detailed records of every shared financial obligation, every asset we'd accumulated, and every expense Daniel had incurred during his affair. My obsessive record-keeping habits, previously mocked by Daniel as excessive, now became weapons in a war he didn't even know we were fighting. I spent the weekend creating a comprehensive financial inventory. Bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, credit card records, mortgage documents, business financial records, tax returns, property deeds, everything that defined the economic structure of our marriage. I made copies of everything, stored in locations Daniel couldn't access, backed up digitally in accounts he didn't know existed. The process was tedious but therapeutic. Each document represented some aspect of the life I'd built and supported, evidence of my contribution to assets Daniel apparently considered equally his. But now I saw them differently, not as shared property, but as leverage I could deploy strategically. The business records were particularly revealing. Over 3 years, I'd invested $47,000 in startup costs, equipment, and operating expenses. Daniel had contributed approximately $12,000, mostly in the form of time rather than cash. Yet legally, we were equal partners with equal claims to profits and assets. But partnerships require ongoing collaboration, and collaboration requires good faith. Daniel's affair had violated the fundamental trust that made our business relationship possible. I couldn't terminate our partnership unilaterally, but I could make it clear that his continued participation depended on his willingness to negotiate our separation fairly. The client relationships were even more valuable than the financial assets. Most of our business came through my professional network, colleagues who hired us because they trusted my judgment and expertise. Daniel was skilled at client relations once relationships were established, but he'd never demonstrated the ability to develop new business independently. I began reaching out to key clients, ostensibly for routine check-ins, but actually to reinforce my personal relationships with them. I wanted to ensure that if our business partnership dissolved, the clients would understand who had really been driving their projects. The conversations were illuminating. Most clients did see me as the primary contact and Daniel as my support staff, regardless of how we'd structured the partnership officially. But the most powerful leverage was emotional, not financial. Daniel's relationship with Sarah was built on a foundation of lies and omissions. She believed she was dating someone in the process of ending an unhappy marriage, someone whose wife was unreasonably holding up their divorce. She had no idea that she was dating someone whose lifestyle was entirely subsidized by the wife he was betraying. I started researching Sarah with the same methodical attention I'd brought to everything else. Social media profiles, professional information, public records, anything that would help me understand who she was and what she valued. The picture that emerged was of someone idealistic and artistic, someone who prided herself on ethical behavior and authentic relationships. Sarah worked at a private elementary school that emphasized character development and social responsibility. Her social media posts were full of quotes about integrity and authenticity, photos of her volunteering at animal shelters and participating in environmental cleanup projects. She appeared to be someone who would be genuinely disturbed to learn that her relationship was built on financial exploitation and systematic deception. I wasn't planning to contact her directly, that would be too messy and dramatic, but I wanted to understand the kind of person Daniel was involved with, the values and expectations she brought to their relationship, because eventually she would need to understand the true cost of the life Daniel had promised her. The turning point came when Daniel texted me on Thursday evening, asking if he could access our joint savings account to pay for a weekend trip he'd planned with Sarah. The casual audacity of the request took my breath away. He wanted to use money I'd saved to fund a romantic getaway with his girlfriend, while I slept alone in the guest bedroom of the house I was paying for. I stared at the message for 20 minutes, feeling something crystallize inside me that was both cold and energizing. This wasn't grief anymore, or anger, or even strategic thinking. This was war, and Daniel had just declared it by assuming I would continue to subsidize his betrayal even after it was exposed. I texted back that the savings account was frozen pending our divorce settlement, which wasn't technically true but wasn't entirely false either. I had the authority to freeze the account, and I used it. Then I called the bank and placed holds on all our joint accounts, explaining that we were in the process of divorce and I needed to protect marital assets. Within an hour, Daniel called me, confused and upset. He tried to access our checking account for dinner with Sarah and found it unavailable. He asked what was happening, as if he genuinely didn't understand that his actions might have consequences. I told him calmly that I was protecting our assets during the separation, which was standard practice in divorce proceedings. If he needed access to funds, he could open his own accounts with his own money. If he wanted to maintain his current lifestyle, he could find a way to pay for it himself. The conversation that followed was revealing. Daniel had no individual credit cards, no personal savings account, no financial resources independent of our marriage. For years, he'd relied entirely on my financial management and support. His teaching salary went into our joint account, where it disappeared into our shared expenses. He'd never needed to budget or save or plan because I'd handled all of that. Now suddenly, he needed to establish independent financial systems while supporting the lifestyle he'd promised Sarah. The weekend trip he'd planned would cost nearly $1,000, money he no longer had access to and couldn't replace on his teacher's salary. I listened to him stumble through explanations and requests and appeals to my sense of fairness and felt something that might have been satisfaction. For the first time since discovering his affair, Daniel was experiencing consequences for his choices. For the first time, his betrayal was costing him something tangible. I told him I was happy to discuss financial arrangements once we had a formal separation agreement in place. Until then, he was welcome to support himself on his own income, the way independent adults typically do. After I hung up, I sat in my living room, the living room I'd decorated and furnished and paid for, and felt a peace I hadn't experienced in months. Daniel wanted out of our marriage, and I was finally ready to let him go, but I was also ready to make sure he understood exactly what he was walking away from. He thought he was trading me for someone better. What he was actually trading was financial security for uncertainty, stability for chaos, a carefully built life for whatever he and Sarah could construct on their combined teacher salaries. And I was about to make sure that education came with a tuition he'd never forget. The unraveling of Daniel's new life happened faster than I'd anticipated, though not fast enough to satisfy the part of me that wanted immediate justice. Within 2 weeks of freezing our accounts, the financial pressures began to show. Within 2 months, his relationship with Sarah started fracturing under the weight of reality. Within 6 months, everything he thought he'd gained by leaving me had crumbled into something that barely resembled the life he'd imagined. I watched it all unfold with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an experiment in controlled conditions. Because that's what it was, essentially, a test of whether love could survive without the financial infrastructure I'd been providing without Daniel even realizing it. The first crack appeared when Daniel had to cancel the weekend trip with Sarah. He'd apparently told her that a temporary banking issue was preventing access to their vacation funds, but she'd offered to pay for the trip herself. That's when Daniel discovered that Sarah, despite her teacher's salary, had saved nearly $8,000 over 2 years of careful budgeting, money she'd been setting aside for a summer trip to Europe. The comparison was devastating for him. Sarah, earning roughly the same salary he did, had managed to save significant money while living independently and supporting herself completely. Daniel, subsidized by my income for the past 5 years, had saved virtually nothing. When she offered to cover their romantic weekend, he was forced to confront the reality that his girlfriend was more financially responsible and independent than he was. He declined her offer, claiming he wanted to pay for their trips himself, which meant their romantic getaways stopped happening entirely. Sarah began to notice that Daniel's lifestyle didn't match his claims about financial stability. The nice dinners out became coffee dates. The concert tickets and weekend trips disappeared. The gifts that had been part of their courtship ritual stopped materializing. I knew all this because I'd maintained connections with several mutual acquaintances, including one of Sarah's colleagues who attended the same yoga studio I frequented. The information came to me naturally, through casual conversations that I didn't seek out but didn't discourage either. I was curious about how Daniel was managing his new reality, and the reports were illuminating. Meanwhile, the business consequences were even more severe than I'd predicted. Without access to our joint accounts, Daniel couldn't cover his share of business expenses. Equipment leases, software subscriptions, professional association dues, all the small costs that kept our consulting company operational, suddenly became his responsibility to fund independently. But more damaging was his inability to invest in business development. Client entertainment, conference attendance, marketing materials, everything that generated new business required upfront costs that Daniel couldn't manage on his teacher's salary. Within 3 months, our client base began to shrink as competitors stepped into gaps that Daniel couldn't fill. I continued handling my existing clients seamlessly, maintaining the relationships and delivering the quality work that had built our reputation. But I stopped bringing in new business, stopped referring potential clients to our company, stopped doing the development work that had grown our revenue year over year. Daniel didn't seem to understand why our income was declining, attributing it to market conditions rather than the withdrawal of my business development efforts. The conversations with our clients became increasingly awkward for Daniel. They would ask about project timelines and budget approvals, expecting him to coordinate with me the way he always had. But our professional relationship had become as frozen as our personal one. I responded to direct client requests promptly and professionally, but I stopped anticipating needs, solving problems before they arose, and covering for Daniel's lack of administrative follow-through. Clients began to notice the change in service quality. Projects that used to run smoothly started experiencing delays and communication gaps. The seamless collaboration they'd come to expect from our team devolved into a more fractured experience where they sometimes had to coordinate between Daniel and me separately. 3 months after our separation, we lost our biggest client, a contract worth about $8,000 a year in recurring revenue. The client cited communication issues and expressed concern about our team's stability. Daniel was devastated, but I felt only a cold satisfaction. He was finally experiencing the consequences of destroying a partnership that had taken years to build. The most revealing development was Daniel's inability to establish independent credit. Years of relying on my income and credit score had left him with a thin financial profile. He could open basic checking and savings accounts, but qualifying for credit cards or loans required documentation of income and assets he simply didn't have. His teacher's salary wasn't sufficient to qualify for an apartment lease in any neighborhood comparable to ours. The security deposits, utility connections, and rental applications required upfront costs and credit checks that exposed the reality of his financial situation. Daniel had been living a lifestyle that was completely unsustainable on his actual income, subsidized by my earnings and credit worthiness. Sarah's apartment became his de facto residence, but that arrangement created its own pressures. She lived in a modest one-bedroom place that reflected her actual income level, comfortable but hardly luxurious. The space wasn't designed for two people, and Daniel's possessions began to overwhelm her carefully organized environment. More significantly, Sarah started to understand the financial implications of their relationship. Daniel's inability to contribute equally to household expenses, entertainment costs, and shared activities became impossible to ignore. She found herself paying for groceries, utilities, and small luxuries that had never been an issue when Daniel was accessing our joint accounts. The dynamic shift was profound. Instead of being courted by someone who seemed financially stable and generous, Sarah discovered she was supporting someone who couldn't manage basic adult responsibilities independently. The romantic relationship that had been built on his apparent success and sophistication suddenly looked like charity work. I heard through my network that Sarah had started asking Daniel direct questions about his financial situation. Why couldn't he qualify for his own apartment? Why did every expense seem to be a struggle? Why had his lifestyle changed so dramatically after separating from his wife? Daniel's explanations apparently focused on my alleged unreasonableness during our divorce proceedings. He painted me as vindictive and controlling, someone who was using financial manipulation to punish him for leaving an unhappy marriage. But Sarah was smart enough to recognize that something didn't add up about his narrative. The breaking point came when Sarah discovered the true timeline of Daniel's affair. Through mutual friends and social media investigation that put my own research to shame, she learned that Daniel had been involved with her while still living with me as a married couple. The story he'd told her about being separated and working through divorce proceedings turned out to be completely fabricated. Sarah realized that she'd been dating a married man whose wife was not only unaware of their relationship, but was actively supporting his ability to maintain it financially. Every dinner they'd shared, every gift he'd given her, every romantic gesture had been funded by the woman he was betraying. She'd unknowingly participated in the destruction of someone else's marriage while believing she was in an honest relationship with someone available to date. The confrontation between Sarah and Daniel was apparently explosive. She felt manipulated and used, complicit in deception she'd never consented to participate in. Daniel's attempts to minimize his lies and frame everything as a complicated situation that had evolved beyond his control only made her angrier. But what ended their relationship wasn't just the moral dimension of his betrayal, it was the practical recognition that their future together was unsustainable. Sarah could support herself comfortably on her salary, but she couldn't support both of them at the lifestyle level Daniel expected. The life he'd promised her required financial resources neither of them possessed independently. Daniel moved out of Sarah's apartment and into a studio place in a neighborhood significantly less desirable than either our home or her previous living situation. The rent consumed nearly half his take-home pay, leaving little money for anything beyond basic necessities. His lifestyle contracted dramatically, from the comfortable middle-class existence I'd provided to something much closer to the economic reality of a single teacher's income. The business collapsed entirely 6 months after our separation. Without new clients, ongoing projects gradually concluded without replacement revenue. Daniel tried to maintain operations independently, but he lacked both the business development skills and the financial resources to sustain the company we'd built together. I'd already transitioned my key clients to direct contracts with me personally, maintaining the relationships and revenue streams that had always been tied to my professional network. Daniel was left with a few smaller clients who gradually drifted away as they realized the quality and reliability of service had changed. The dissolution of our business partnership required legal mediation, another expense Daniel could barely afford. He argued for ongoing compensation based on the clients and infrastructure we'd built together, but the mediator quickly understood that the business had been dependent on my connections, my financial investment, and my administrative management. Daniel received a settlement that covered his minimal contribution to business assets, but no ongoing revenue share. The clients, the systems, the reputation, everything that made the business valuable stayed with me because it had always been mine in any meaningful sense. The most painful consequence for Daniel was the social dimension of his choices. Our mutual friends initially tried to remain neutral, but the practical realities of divorce made that impossible. Most of our social circle was connected to my professional network or consisted of couples I'd cultivated relationships with over the years. Daniel discovered that many of the friendships he'd assumed were his own were actually extensions of my social capital. Invitations stopped coming. Group activities he'd enjoyed were no longer offered to him. The social life he'd taken for granted had been built on foundations I'd provided, just like everything else. Sarah's departure from his life meant the loss of her social circle as well. The new friends he'd begun making through her, the activities and communities she'd introduced him to, the broader social world that had made his affair feel like an upgrade, all of that disappeared when their relationship ended. 6 months after leaving our marriage, Daniel was essentially starting over at age 34 with the social, financial, and professional resources of someone a decade younger. The life he'd built with me hadn't just been left behind, it had been revealed as never really his to begin with. I watched all of this unfold with mixed emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, in watching someone experience consequences for their choices. But there was also sadness at the waste of it all, the years of building something together that had been destroyed by his inability to appreciate what we'd created. The strangest part was realizing how much better my own life had become without him. The constant financial drain of supporting his lifestyle was gone. The emotional labor of managing someone else's irresponsibility had ended. The stress of carrying the practical burden for two people while pretending it was an equal partnership had lifted. My income was mine to spend and save and invest as I saw fit. My time was my own. My decisions didn't require consultation with someone who contributed little but expected equal say in everything. For the first time in years, I was living at my actual means rather than subsidizing someone else's expectations. Daniel had thought he was trading up by leaving me for Sarah and the new life she represented. What he'd actually done was trade away the elaborate support system I'd created for him, the financial infrastructure that made his comfortable lifestyle possible, the professional and social networks that gave his life structure and meaning. He'd confused my support with shared success, my competence with our combined efforts, my financial foundation with his own capabilities. When those supports were removed, he discovered that very little of the life he'd been living was actually sustainable by his own efforts. The education was expensive, and I made sure he paid every penny of the tuition himself. It's been 3 years since Daniel left our marriage for what he thought would be a better life. 3 years since I discovered the true cost of building a foundation for someone who never learned to value what he was standing on. 3 years since I transformed from enabler to strategist, from victim to someone who understood that love without boundaries is just another word for exploitation. The mortgage statements still arrive in my name. I kept the house, bought out Daniel's half at a price that reflected its actual market value rather than the inflated worth he'd imagined. The transaction was surprisingly smooth once he realized he had no other options. His credit couldn't support a mortgage for his share of the equity, and he needed the cash more than he needed to maintain ownership of a home he could never afford to maintain. I walk through these rooms now with a satisfaction that has nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with ownership in its truest sense. Every surface, every improvement, every carefully chosen detail reflects decisions I made with my own money, my own time, my own vision of what a home should be. The Italian marble countertops still gleam under the pendant lights I researched and installed. The hardwood floors still creak in the same spots, but now the sound feels welcoming rather than mournful. The guest bedroom is an office now, fitted with the standing desk and ergonomic chair I'd always wanted but couldn't justify when Daniel's needs took priority over mine. The master bedroom has new furniture, new linens, new art on the walls, everything chosen to please only me. I sleep better now than I have in years, no longer sharing space with someone whose presence had become a source of stress rather than comfort. My financial life has flourished in ways I couldn't have predicted. Without Daniel's drain on our resources, I've been able to increase my retirement contributions, build an emergency fund that actually feels adequate, and make investments I'd always deferred for the sake of family financial goals. My consulting business, freed from the dead weight of a partner who contributed little but expected equal profits, generates nearly twice the revenue it did when we were supposedly working together. The house has appreciated significantly over the past 3 years, helped by the improvements I continued making once I no longer had to negotiate every decision with someone who had opinions, but no financial stake in the outcomes. The kitchen renovation I'd planned for years finally happened, funded entirely by my income and designed entirely to my preferences. The backyard landscaping project that Daniel had always delayed became a reality 6 months after he left. I entertain more than I used to, hosting dinner parties and book clubs and professional gatherings in spaces that feel authentically mine. My guests often comment on how well-designed and comfortable the house feels, how every detail seems intentional and cohesive. They don't know they're seeing the vision I always had but could never fully implement when I had to accommodate someone else's preferences and budget constraints. Dating has been interesting, though not in ways I expected. I'm more selective now, more attuned to signs of financial irresponsibility or emotional dependence. I've ended promising relationships when I noticed patterns that reminded me too much of my marriage, men who seemed impressed by my success but didn't have equivalent achievements of their own, who were drawn to my stability but couldn't offer reciprocal security. There have been 2 serious relationships since Daniel, both with men who had their own houses, their own established careers, their own social circles and financial independence. The dynamics felt entirely different from my marriage, partnerships of equals rather than one person carrying the other. Both ended amicably when we realized we wanted different futures, but neither left me feeling drained or diminished. The most surprising development has been how little I think about Daniel anymore. For the first year after our divorce, I followed his declining circumstances with the fascination of someone watching a slow-motion train wreck they'd predicted but couldn't prevent. Now, his life feels irrelevant to mine, like a cautionary tale I once lived through but no longer need to revisit. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he eventually moved back in with his parents, unable to afford independent housing on his teacher's salary. The studio apartment became too expensive once he realized that teacher salaries don't support the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to during our marriage. His parents' house is in the suburb where he grew up, an hour commute from the school where he teaches, in a neighborhood that represents a significant step down from the life we'd built together. He started dating again about a year after Sarah left him, though the relationship seemed shorter and less substantial than what we had or what he'd found with Sarah. I suspect he's discovering that most independent, successful women aren't interested in supporting a man who can't manage his own affairs. The dynamic that worked when I was young and optimistic about love conquering practical concerns doesn't appeal to women in their 30s who have their own established lives. Our mutual friends occasionally mention him in passing, usually in contexts that reveal how much his social world has contracted. He's not invited to the same gatherings anymore, partly because many of our friends have aligned with me in the divorce, but mostly because his circumstances have changed so dramatically that he no longer fits into the social and economic circles where we used to move together. The business world we shared has moved on without him entirely. I maintained relationships with all our important clients and gradually expanded my own consulting practice to the point where I had to hire 2 part-time contractors to handle overflow work. The company Daniel and I built together has been replaced by something larger and more profitable, built on the foundation of relationships and reputation I'd developed over years of competent work. Daniel's attempts to maintain a consulting practice of his own apparently failed within the first year. Without my business development skills, my professional network, and my administrative support, he couldn't generate enough clients to sustain even a part-time practice. He's back to teaching full-time now, supplementing his income with tutoring work that pays poorly but fits his schedule. The most telling detail I heard was that he'd applied for financial aid to complete his master's degree, the advanced credential he'd always claimed he wanted to pursue, but never found time for during our marriage. Apparently, his current financial situation qualified him for need-based assistance, which says everything about how far his circumstances have fallen. Sarah moved to a different city about a year after their relationship ended, accepting a position at a private school that offered significantly better compensation and professional development opportunities. From what I understand, she's thriving professionally and personally, apparently having learned valuable lessons about the importance of financial compatibility in relationships. The irony isn't lost on me that Sarah, who thought she was dating someone financially stable and generous, discovered that she was actually more capable of supporting herself than the man she'd fallen for. The experience apparently transformed her approach to relationships, making her more careful about financial transparency and individual accountability. I respect her for how she handled the situation once she understood the truth. She could have stayed with Daniel despite the deception, convincing herself that love was enough to overcome practical obstacles. Instead, she recognized that their relationship was built on false foundations and had the courage to rebuild her life around honest principles. The legal aftermath of our divorce was less complicated than I'd feared, but more expensive than Daniel had anticipated. The asset division proceeded roughly as my attorneys had predicted. He received his share of the house equity and retirement accounts, but I retained ownership of the business, the professional relationships, and most of the tangible assets we'd accumulated. Daniel's legal fees consumed a significant portion of his settlement, partly because he'd unrealistic expectations about what he could claim and partly because he kept changing attorneys when they told him things he didn't want to hear. I used the same lawyer throughout the process, someone recommended by my professional network who specialized in high-asset divorces and understood the complexities of business partnerships. The alimony question was resolved in my favor when it became clear that Daniel's lower income was primarily the result of his career choices rather than his contributions to our marriage. His decision to teach rather than pursue more lucrative work had been enabled by my financial support, not limited by my demands. The court recognized that he was capable of supporting himself at a level appropriate to his education and experience. My own career has accelerated in ways that would have been impossible if I'd remained married to Daniel. Without the constant interruptions of managing his needs and problems, I've been able to focus entirely on professional development and business growth. I've spoken at industry conferences, published articles in professional journals, and developed expertise in areas I'd never had time to explore when I was managing a household for two. The promotion I'd missed while dealing with Daniel's affair came through 18 months later, along with a salary increase that more than compensated for the career momentum I'd lost during the worst period of our marriage. My boss mentioned that my work had become noticeably more focused and consistent after my divorce, though she was tactful enough not to draw explicit connections between my personal life and professional performance. I've traveled more in the past 3 years than in the previous decade, taking trips to conferences and destinations I'd always wanted to visit but couldn't afford when I was supporting Daniel's lifestyle. Last year, I finally took that trip to Tuscany he'd always dreamed about but never saved for. I stayed in the kind of villa he'd fantasized about, ate at restaurants I researched meticulously, and enjoyed every moment of luxury I'd earned through my own efforts. The experience felt like closing a circle that had been left open for too long. I wasn't proving anything to Daniel or seeking some form of retroactive vindication. I was simply living the life I'd always been capable of creating once I stopped subsidizing someone else's dreams at the expense of my own. My relationship with money has evolved in interesting ways. I'm more protective of my resources but also more generous with them, now that I can trust my own judgment about how they're used. I donate more to charity, invest more aggressively in my retirement, and spend more freely on experiences and purchases that bring me genuine pleasure. The financial anxiety that characterized my marriage, the constant worry about whether we could afford Daniel's wants and needs, has been replaced by a calm confidence in my ability to manage my resources effectively. I know exactly what my money is going toward and why, without having to negotiate or justify every decision with someone whose priorities often conflicted with practical realities. The house has become a source of pride rather than stress. Every improvement increases value I'll retain entirely. Every mortgage payment builds equity that belongs completely to me. Every utility bill and property tax payment supports something I chose and can afford comfortably. The burden of homeownership feels lighter when you're not carrying someone else's weight along with your own. Friends sometimes ask if I regret the years I invested in my marriage, whether I feel like that time was wasted or stolen. The answer is complicated. I regret enabling patterns that ultimately hurt both Daniel and me. I regret not recognizing earlier how unbalanced our relationship had become. I regret the professional opportunities I missed and the personal growth I deferred while focusing so intensely on managing our shared life. But I don't regret the experience entirely. It taught me things about myself I couldn't have learned any other way, about my capacity for both sacrifice and strength, about the difference between generosity and enabling, about the importance of building a life that can stand on its own foundation rather than leaning on someone else's support. Most importantly, it taught me that love without accountability isn't really love at all. It's a transaction disguised as emotion, a way of avoiding the hard work of building genuine partnership between equals. The relationships I've had since Daniel feel more honest, more sustainable, more grounded in mutual respect and reciprocal contribution. I'm not bitter anymore, though I was for a long time. The anger that sustained me through the worst period of our separation has mellowed into something more like satisfaction with my current life than resentment about my past. Daniel made his choices and I made mine in response. We both live with the consequences, but only one of us seems to have learned from them. The woman who opened her door to a rain-soaked husband begging to come home, who built a life around someone else's dreams while neglecting her own, who sacrificed her stability to enable someone else's irresponsibility, that woman is gone. She's been replaced by someone harder but happier, more careful but more confident, less trusting but more genuinely loved. And every month when the mortgage statement arrives with my name as the sole borrower, I'm reminded that some foundations are strong enough to support whatever you choose to build on them. I still get the mortgage statements for the house where my husband lives with his new wife. Except now, there's no husband and no new wife, just me, the woman who built something lasting enough to survive the person who tried to take it down. The irony of that opening line, the one that started this story, isn't lost on me now. When I first spoke those words, they felt like an accusation, evidence of injustice, proof that the world had allowed someone else to claim what I'd created. Now they feel like victory. Every month, that statement arrives with my name alone, a reminder that some things are too well built to be taken by people who never understood their value. This isn't a story about revenge, though I know it might sound like one. It's a story about what happens when someone mistakes enablement for love, support for partnership, generosity for stupidity. It's about the difference between building something together and building something for someone who is always planning to walk away. People ask me sometimes if I'm proud of how things turned out, if I'm satisfied with the way Daniel's life collapsed after he left mine. The question always surprises me because it assumes I orchestrated his downfall, that I actively worked to destroy him the way he destroyed our marriage. But that's not what happened. I didn't ruin Daniel's life, I simply stopped subsidizing it. I didn't sabotage his relationship with Sarah, I just stopped providing the financial foundation that made his deception possible. I didn't destroy his business prospects, I merely withdrew the support and connections that had been propping up his independence illusion. Daniel destroyed his own life by confusing my contributions with his capabilities, my infrastructure with his achievements, my foundation with shared ground. When those supports were removed, everything that depended on them collapsed because it had never been structurally sound to begin with. The hardest lesson I learned wasn't about Daniel's capacity for betrayal, it was about my own capacity for self-deception. For years, I told myself that carrying the financial burden was temporary, that managing all our practical affairs was just playing to our strengths, that enabling his irresponsibility was really supporting his dreams. I convinced myself that love meant making someone's life easier, not helping them become stronger. I believed that partnership meant one person could coast while the other carried the load, as long as the coasting partner contributed charm and creativity and emotional support. But real partnership isn't about one person building a life that the other person gets to inhabit. It's about two people building something together that neither could create alone. It requires mutual investment, shared sacrifice, equal stake in both the success and the maintenance of what you've created. I gave Daniel the gift of security without responsibility, comfort without contribution, benefits without obligation. Then I was surprised when he learned to see those gifts as entitlements rather than investments in our shared future. The woman I am now would never make those mistakes. She understands that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's a transaction where one person pays with their resources and receives promises that are never backed by action. She knows that supporting someone's dreams means helping them develop the skills to achieve those dreams independently, not building the dreams for them while they take credit for the architecture. Most importantly, she's learned that you can't create a partnership with someone who sees your contributions as a given rather than a gift. True collaboration requires two people who understand that what they're building together could be lost if either stops investing in its maintenance. The house I live in now feels different than the one I shared with Daniel, even though it's the same structure with most of the same furniture. The difference isn't in what's here but in what's absent: the tension of unequal investment, the resentment of unrecognized sacrifice, the anxiety of supporting someone who might leave at any moment for something that seemed more appealing. Every mortgage payment I make now builds equity that belongs entirely to me. Every improvement increases value I'll retain completely. Every decision reflects priorities I set without having to negotiate with someone whose interests often conflicted with practical realities. But more than the financial freedom, what I value most is the emotional clarity. I no longer have to wonder if someone loves me or just loves what I provide. I don't have to worry that my competence is making someone else feel small, or that my success is threatening someone's sense of themselves. The relationships I have now, romantic, professional, and friendship, are built on foundations of mutual respect and reciprocal contribution. No one is carrying anyone else. No one is being subsidized by someone else's sacrifice. No one is confusing another person's support with their own capabilities. It's a lonely standard sometimes. There are fewer people willing or able to meet the requirements of genuine partnership than there are people looking for someone to make their lives easier. I've ended relationships that might have been comfortable if I'd been willing to return to my old patterns of overfunctioning and underexpecting. But the loneliness of high standards is preferable to the exhaustion of low ones. I'd rather be alone than be with someone who sees my strengths as resources to exploit rather than qualities to admire and reciprocate. Daniel taught me without meaning to that it's possible to give someone everything they need to be successful and still watch them fail because they never learned to value what they were given. He showed me that generosity without boundaries isn't kindness, it's enabling disguised as love. He also taught me something about resilience I might never have discovered otherwise. When someone tries to take away what you've built, you learn what actually belongs to you versus what you were sharing with someone who never truly appreciated it. The parts of my life that survived Daniel's departure were the parts that had always been mine: my skills, my relationships, my work ethic, my capacity for building and rebuilding. The parts that crumbled when he left were the parts that had been propped up by his presence: the illusion of partnership, the fantasy of shared goals, the belief that someone else's dreams were worth sacrificing my own stability to support. I don't miss those illusions. They were expensive to maintain, and they prevented me from seeing clearly what I was actually creating versus what I thought I was sharing. Sarah learned similar lessons, though more quickly and at a lower cost than I did. Her relationship with Daniel lasted months rather than years, and she recognized the red flags before she'd invested too deeply in supporting someone who couldn't support himself. I respect her for having the courage to walk away once she understood what she was really being asked to take on. She built a life after Daniel that reflects what she learned from the experience. From what I've heard, she's more financially careful now, more insistent on equal contribution, less willing to subsidize someone else's lifestyle while calling it love. We both paid tuition in the school of expensive relationships, but we both graduated with degrees that will serve us well in the future. The most surprising outcome of this entire experience has been the peace I feel about being alone, not lonely, alone. There's a difference between solitude chosen from a position of strength and isolation imposed by circumstances beyond your control. I chose this solitude after learning that the wrong company is more depleting than the right solitude. I'd rather eat dinner by myself in a house I own completely than share a meal with someone who expects me to pay for it, plan it, cook it, and clean up afterward while they contribute conversation and appreciation. I'd rather travel alone to places I want to see than stay home because someone else can't afford to join me and I'm expected to either pay their way or sacrifice the experience entirely. I'd rather make decisions based on my own priorities and resources than constantly negotiate with someone whose dreams are bigger than their contributions and whose expectations are larger than their efforts. This doesn't mean I'm closed off to partnership. It means I understand now what real partnership looks like, and I'm not willing to accept substitutes that drain my resources while providing the illusion of connection. When the right person comes along, someone who has built their own foundation, who brings equal resources to our shared table, who understands that love is about mutual investment rather than one-sided support, I'll be ready to build something together that neither of us could create alone. But until then, I'm content with what I've already built, a life that belongs entirely to me, a house that reflects my choices and priorities, a business that rewards my efforts without having to share profits with someone who contributes little, relationships that nourish rather than drain, financial security that depends on my decisions alone. The mortgage statements still arrive each month, but now they tell a different story, not about what was taken from me, but about what I was strong enough to keep. Not about what I lost, but about what I built well enough to survive the person who tried to tear it down. Daniel thought he was trading me for something better. What he actually did was teach me the difference between building a life with someone and building a life for someone, between supporting someone's dreams and subsidizing their delusions, between love that strengthens both people and love that depletes one to benefit the other. In the end, he gave me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge of my own strength, the understanding of my own worth, and the recognition that I never needed anyone else to validate what I was capable of creating. I built a life for us, and now I live in it alone. And it turns out that's exactly where it was always meant to be, in the hands of the person who understood its true value from the beginning. The foundation was always strong enough to support whatever I chose to build on it. I just had to stop sharing it with someone who was only interested in what it could hold up for him. Some lessons are expensive, but they're worth every penny of the tuition when they teach you who you really are underneath all the ways you've learned to give yourself away.